This resource is the second in a two-part series on using the student's t-distribution to compare the means for two populations. Part 1 describes the general process. We develop the hypothesis we wish to test and determine if we want to use both tails of the graph for the distribution, or only one. We describe two methods for determining an appropriate number of degrees of freedom. We consider the method to find the appropriate t-score for our comparison of means. We investigate two methods for deciding whether or not we have sufficient evidence to conclude if the means are the same or not, and finish by describing how to present our findings. Part 2 of the series goes through the entire process with an example with real-world implications. Shortly after the housing bubble burst in 2008, many homeowners could not afford to make their mortgage payments. Banks subsequently foreclosed on the defaulted mortgages. This example comes from Business Statistics by Sharp, DeVoe, and Vellman. According to recent reports, home foreclosures were up 47% in March 2008 compared to the previous year, as reported by realestate.msn.com in April 2008. The data show home foreclosure rates as a percent change from the previous year for samples of cities in two regions of the U.S., the Northeast and the Southwest. What we want to determine is if there is a statistically significant difference between the foreclosure rates in the two regions. We will use the notation X bar sub S to represent the average change in foreclosure rate in the Southwest, and X bar sub N to be the average change in foreclosure rate in the Northeast. What we want to disprove is that the average foreclosure rate for the two regions are the same. Therefore, our null hypothesis, what we hope to have sufficient evidence to reject, is that X bar sub S minus X bar sub N is 0. The alternative hypothesis would be that the difference is not 0. Because we seek to prove the two means different, we do not care which is larger. Therefore, we will need to use the two-tail percentages when we find the p-values for the t-score we calculate. In order to find the appropriate t-score, we first need to find numerous other values. We need the mean for each population, as well as the sample standard deviation for each population. Completing these calculations, we find that the average change in foreclosure rate in the Northeast was 2.1245%, with a standard deviation of 3.840. The average change in foreclosure rate in the Southwest was 17.0658%, with a standard deviation of 5.303. Because we know the sample standard deviations and sample sizes for each of those samples, we can also find the standard error of the difference of sample means. Performing those calculations, we have a standard error of 1.489. We also find the degrees of freedom to be 33 if we use the full formula, but only 27 if we use the simpler method. Now we can find our t-score. The formula for the t-score is the difference of the sample means divided by the standard error for that difference. We plug the values in that we previously calculated. Simplifying, we find that the t-score for the difference of means is 10.03. Now we need to determine if we have sufficient evidence to reject the null. First, let's consider the critical t method. As is traditional with difference of means, we will consider a 95% confidence level. Therefore, the critical t values are solely dependent on the number of degrees of freedom. If we use the official formula, we had 33 degrees of freedom. The critical t-value for a 95% confidence level with 33 degrees of freedom is 2.037. We realize that the t-score for our information, 10.03, is greater than this critical t-value. If we consider the shortcut method, we had 27 degrees of freedom. The critical t-value for 95% confidence level with 27 degrees of freedom is 2.052. Again, our t-score is much greater than this critical t-value. In either case, because our t-score is greater than the critical t-value, we reject the null hypothesis. But how does this work if we employ the p-value method of hypothesis testing? To find the p-value for a t-score of 10.03, we could attempt to use a table of values. Unfortunately, this value will not be on any standard table. We instead could use an online p-value calculator, such as the one linked on screen. Inserting our information for either 33 or 27 degrees of freedom, we find that our p-value is less than 1/10,000th, which is much less than the allowable 0.05 allowable with 95% confidence. As with the critical t-value method, we have ample evidence to reject the null hypothesis. But what exactly does that mean for our example? As we saw, we were able to reject the null hypothesis. This means that we had sufficient evidence to show that the difference of the mean change in foreclosure rates for the Northeast and the Southwest was legitimately not zero. We conclude that the change in foreclosure rates for those two regions is statistically significantly different from one another.